it sounds to me, based on your prayer requests, that you have problems in your life.
Yep. Or other people.
You have problems in your life, right?
Yeah.
And I have 4 sermons I was going through this week trying to decide which one to do, because they all dealt with the same issue of dealing with problems in your life and dealing with Satan. For example, there was this missionary who was in some area in Africa where he was in this small little town and was bringing Jesus to this town. And of course, there was a lot of opposition from the local witch doctor, and so those who don't believe in the Christian message. And there was a lot of animosity against this person, and there was threats against this person and against their house, and they said, if you don't get out of here, stop, we're going to burn you out. Well, the pastor, hearing about this, tried to encourage people to leave while they could, when there was not going to be any danger. And some people did leave, but many of the people stayed, and sure enough, the witch doctor and a gang of men came through with their threat and came and started yelling and screaming and surrounded the house and started throwing fire onto the house. And it was one of those kind of houses that would go up very quickly. And as this was happening, the pastor and his wife and their 3 kids gathered themselves in the middle of the house and knelt and prayed. And there they were praying while this was going on. A couple of the men came over to the window and looked in and saw them praying. And one of the men had taken an axe and threw it at the pastor, barely nicking his leg. The house came on fire. The men surrounded the house, and it was on fire, and it was just a roaring blaze. Some of the people who were Christians from the community came from a distance and saw what was going on, but were hesitant and afraid to do anything. When the house burnt down and the fire was all there, in ashes, the men went in to try to find the bodies, and there were no bodies. And as they were searching through, looking for the bodies, they looked over and they saw a group of the Christians coming and walking towards the house. And walking along with them was the pastor and his family. And the men were shocked because they saw what had happened. They burnt the house down. The men had looked in through the window, saw the people praying, and they knew they were in there. They surrounded the house, and yet they were not there. And so the pastor said and explained how God had sent his holy angels to protect him. He said, just like Daniel in the lion's den, and just like Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. And this made such an impact on the community that people started coming back. And some of the men who were in that group to burn down the house eventually became believers. Now, you don't have that thing happening, I guess, at your house. But you have some things that probably cause a lot of consternation. You may feel attacked at times. And there are a lot of great promises in the Bible, but I'm going to give you a sermon this morning that I would probably venture to say you've never had given to you before. Or you probably had it quoted, but maybe have never had the whole chapter done in the way I'm going to present it this morning. So I want you this morning to turn to Psalms 91. And I guess the pastor and I miscommunicated because I thought he heard what the sermon title was going to be today, but I noticed he didn't write it. So I'll tell you what the sermon title is, because it's going to be the 3 points that you can take notes on. And it's the 3 ways you're going to take Psalms 91 and divide it into 3 parts. The title of the sermon today is Protection, Provocation, and Promises. And my point today is, as we do battle with Satan's provocations, and you know what the word provoke means. A provocation comes from the word provoke. Provoke is what you do when you have a stick and you have an angry dog and you start poking it at the dog. He's going to bite the stick off of maybe your hand. You hassle someone, you harass someone. As we battle with Satan's provocations, we can gain victory by committing to God's protection and God's promises. So today, we're going to look at Psalms 91 and divide it into 3 parts. God's protection, Satan's provocations, and God's promises. It says, He who dwells. Now, to dwell somewhere means to go live somewhere, correct? You have a house you dwell in. And see, in order to dwell in that house, you're doing something. When you have your furniture there, when you have your clothes there, when you have your personal effects there, you made a commitment to the house. Correct? So right away, he starts out with this idea under the word protection, that he who dwells implies life, taking up residence implies a commitment. So what we need to do today is make a commitment to, number one, his 9 words of protection. For he says, he who dwells in the shelter of the Most High. Now we think of a shelter as being a place where you're protected. Some words where shelter is used in our society today is when you hear of a police action going on in your neighborhood where you work, and the first thing they do is they have a thing called shelter in place, which means wherever you are, stay there. Get in hiding. If you lived in the Midwest, you listen for 2 things every day when you get up from probably about March through most of the summer. You check the weather reports. You especially maybe look at the Weather Channel, and then you keep your ear out for the air raid sirens and the sky. Because as soon as you see the sky forming a certain way, and you know what the weatherman said, that there's a potential of tornadoes, and then you hear the siren go off, you go find a shelter in place. It may be your home where you go down to a basement. It may be if you're stuck in Walmart or somewhere like that, they have a place where they funnel the people to be as protective as possible in that area. The idea of a shelter is that you find peace during chaos going on around you. Next he says, he who shelters, so there's your first protection word, and rest in the shadow of the Almighty. Now, when I'm walking lately, it seems like I walk later in the morning. I'd much rather walk at 6:30 or 7 rather than 11:30 or 12. But what I find is that I'm walking along, I can feel a temperature change of 5 degrees whether I'm in trees or I'm out of trees, because I'm in the shadow. A shadow means I'm being protected. A shade and shadow means I'm being protected from the sun. So God is our shadow because he protects us from the sun of the hassles that Satan throws at us. Then he uses this next word twice. In verse 2, I will say of the Lord, he is my refuge. And it's used twice. It's used again a little farther down. We hear the word refuge a lot today. In fact, it's used twice in the Psalms 91. First it says, he is my refuge. The word refuge there is being used as a predicate adjective. Now this takes you back to when you were at school and learned English. A predicate adjective follows a subject, a linking verb, and then the adjective describes the subject. So God is a refuge. But then it says a little later, he says, you will find refuge. Now it's used as a noun, more specifically a direct object. You as a subject, find as a verb. You find what? You find refuge. God is a refuge. Today we hear a lot about refuge. We hear of people coming across our borders and cramming our borders, and you're all about that news, so I won't tell you all about it and all that issue. But the reason they're coming is they're trying to find refuge in this country from the mess that's in their country. The drug gangs. I remember reading about Honduras, particularly, one that has one of the highest murder rates in the world of any country. And there are places like San Pedro de Sula and some of the other ones where there are young people in those cities, there's a 50% chance they're not going to live out of their teens because of where they live. So no wonder the parents even sending the kids north to try to get out of that and get away somewhere. They try to find refuge. We've been going on with a war in Iraq and Syria and some of that stuff, and ISIS, and that war's been going on for 5 or 6, 7 years. And there's refugee camps in those areas where people have gone to find protection, where at least they have food, water, and protection. God is our refuge, who protects us during the wars we go on. Next he says, I will say of the Lord, he is my refuge and my, next word, fortress. Now we can think of a fortress. Back in the Bible time, most of the large cities had walls around them, Jericho being one, Jerusalem being one. And as we go on later in history, we have the Crusades, and we have the king who would have his large castle and a place where the people would be inside there and put a moat around it so they would have protection. A little bit later, we take U.S. history and we have settlers going across west, and here comes the Indians. So what do? They hustle as fast as they could to get inside the fort, the fortress, for protection. God says he is a protective person. So we think of a shelter, which is a place. We think of a shadow, which is a thing. We think of a refuge, meaning a place where you can gain protection. We think of a fortress as being a large structure. And then he says this next word. And it's found down here in verse, where'd it go here? I have them underlined, so I should remember. Oh, there it is. Verse 4, he will cover you with his feathers. Under his wings you will find refuge. Feather and wings. Now, you say to yourself, how can feather and wings give protection? Well, Jesus talked about that in Matthew, where he talked about that, where he prays over Jerusalem. Near the end of Matthew, he says, how I would wish I could be like a hen who puts my feathers around you and protects you. There's a story about a place that had a fire that burned through, kind of like the fires we had a few years ago, and burned through this area. And as they came to this house, the house was burnt down, the barn was burned down, a lot of the things of the area was burnt down. And so as people were going around poking around it, they kept hearing this chirp, chirp, chirp. And they said, what? What is going on? Chirp, chirp. And so as they came around, they found a large hen, dead, burnt. But as they lifted up the feather, there were about 4 or 5 chicks who were protected and saved. So God, again, is like that for us. He is our protection, like a feather. Then it says here, will be our shield. Now, you know, the Bible tells us in Ephesians 6, it talks about the armor of God, and one of the pieces of the armor is a shield. The shield of all the armor that you have, I'm not talking about the sword. Other than the sword, all the armor mentioned there is all defensive. The sword is the only thing you have that's offensive. It's the only thing that's defensive, and the shield is the only part of the armor that has flexibility. See, I can't take my helmet. I can turn my head, but the helmet stays on my head. I can turn my upper body, and the breastplate stays there. But my shield, I can turn and go any direction I want from whatever directions the arrows are coming against me. See, God is flexible. God will help us in all sorts of situations. A real good example of a shield situation is the movie called Risen. You may have seen it before. It's a Christian movie, and it's about a official officer in the Roman army who probably was around and involved in the crucifixion. But it shows in the beginning of the movie, he is with a bunch of other men who are fighting against the Jews and the Zealots who are fighting against them. And they're throwing rocks against them and rocks against them. And finally, the man says, we need to charge. The Roman soldiers charged. So what they did is they got into 2 lines, and they took their shield and they put it like this. So what you had the soldiers walked along with their shields like this. It was almost like they put a roof over their head, and the rocks are being thrown at them, but it was just bouncing off the shields, and they were able to get close enough to win their battle. God is a shield and watches over us and protects us. Then the next word he uses is a shield and a rampart. Now I had to look that word up, and what a rampart is I'll give you an example. If you were in that room over there and suddenly somebody came in who was trying to do you harm and started shooting, the first thing you might do is put the table down and put it in front of you. That's a rampart. Back in the old days, it might be taking a bunch of dirt and pushing it up so a mound, and then putting some logs across it and rocks across it so you could hide behind it. That would be a rampart. God again. So all these examples I've given you right now are all explaining and showing how God protects and watches over us. And the last one he uses, where it says, he is our dwelling. Now you say, I thought I heard the word dwell. No, you heard the word dwell, but now dwelling. Not used as a verb, but used as a place. Again, a place of where God watches over you and commits to you. So God is our dwelling. He commits to us. There was a gentleman who was out hunting one day, and as he was out hunting and walking down this wide road, he suddenly heard something over in the bushes over here, and he looked up, and this rabbit came running out towards him. Now, when I go walking, I'm at Bananadale and places like that, I see rabbits, and I've never had one run towards me. They always go away. But he ran towards the hunter and came and ran right between his feet and stood there. He said, what is going on? Well, then he said, what is going on? Then he looked up and saw the problem. A coyote came out. A coyote had been chasing that rabbit. And the rabbit only looked for some place to get help, and for some reason he saw the human as a place to get help. And that's where he was. So the hunter put this all together, what was going on. So he lifted his rifle and aimed at the coyote, not to shoot the coyote, but he just shot around it. So the coyote would take off, and sure enough he did, through the bushes, over the hill, and gone. And he spoke to the rabbit. He says, "Your danger is gone now." And the rabbit looked around and hopped away. That hunter was what I just mentioned God is, our protection, a refuge, a shelter, a fortress. We need that because of our second word, provocation. To provoke is where you hassle somebody, you harass somebody, you bother people. Satan does that to us, doesn't he? All the time, 24/7, 365, never takes a day off. He provokes us, harasses us. And this harassment can get to the point where it can cause us to feel hopeless and discouraged. There are 4 ways, according to Psalm 91, that he harasses us. Number 1, physically. For it says in verse 3, he will save you from the fowler's snare and from the deadly pestilences. Now, pestilence is a illness, a disease. And verse 6 says, nor the pestilence that stalks in the darkness. Then he says, plagues that destroy at midday. Right at this very second, as you're sitting in this church thinking everything is at peace, your body, your immune system was working overtime to protect you from the germs that all of you have brought in. And we all know what happens during the flu season. And we do all sorts of things, protection. Even people wear a mask everywhere, especially when they're a crowd. Our body works overtime. Our immune system, we should be very thankful that God creates it so good, makes it so that it protects us from the germs that are attacking us all the time. And when they don't do a very good job or something overwhelms them, we get sick. And this goes on 24/7. You don't have to think about it. It happens. Our immune system is always at work. The world today is seeing all sorts of illnesses. I read just, I think in the last week, about the Ebola virus making a comeback in Africa and really causing a lot of hassle in some areas in Africa. We mentioned some people today who had some illnesses. Cancer, we know, is rampant. Even happens to supposedly healthy people. And we hear about super germs that now they're worried about because they don't seem to have any vaccine against these super germs that seem to aren't bothered by antibiotics. And yet Jesus said this in Exodus 14:24 as he was just getting the Israelites out of slavery, heading them towards the promised land. They were already starting to learn how to complain. They didn't take long to do that. So he tells them in 14, starting at verse 15, Exodus 15:26, if you will listen carefully to the voice of God and do what is right in his eyes, if you will pay attention to his commands, if you will keep his decrees, I will not bring on you any of the diseases that were brought upon Egypt. I will be your healer. So, as he mentions here, the provocations that attack us physically, Jesus says, I want to be your healer. Just trust me. And then he says he attacks us mentally. For it says in verse 5, you will not fear the terror of night. Many of you may go to bed at night and have things that have hassled you all day. And you're anxious and have anxiety and you have trouble falling asleep. And you have to do things that try to help you fall asleep. Worries that cause the lack of sleep. Worries that wear us down. A shelter is supposed to ease us for a while. But yet Jesus has a solution to those mental issues that attack us. He says in Matthew 11:28-30, he says, come unto me, all who labor and are heavy laden, all who are attacked, all who are under mental attack. He says, I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon him. And he says, I will give you rest. Twice in those verses he says rest. Right along with mental attack is number 3, emotionally attack. For he says in verse 5 again, he says, you will not fear the terror of night, nor the arrow that flies by day. People are attacked by life during the day, and then at night they replay it subconsciously. And that's why sometimes it might be difficult to sleep, get no sleep, or it's not very restful. And again, Jesus gives a solution. Come unto me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Arrows can come at us in a variety of ways. They can be verbal arrows, people who can say things that just cut to the heart. They can be physical arrows, illnesses. They can be financial arrows. They can be a whole lot of things. But yet Jesus says, I'm going to be a shield against those. A shield, as I said, is flexible, is able to take on all sorts of attacks that come from all different directions. So we learn that we're attacked physically, mentally, and emotionally in this psalm, and we're attacked spiritually. For he says in verse 3, surely he will save you from the fowler's snare. You know what that is? You know what a snare is? It's a trap. And many times you don't see the trap. Many times the trap is camouflage to entrap us and enslave us. Snare is a trap. Just read Genesis 3 and we see how Satan lays traps. What he said to Adam and Eve. How he tricked them into giving in and doing exactly what God said don't do. Hebrews 12 tells us about, as Christians, we're running the Christian race. And he says, don't let sin so easily entangles you and snares you, so to speak. He warns against that. One person said this about sin. Sin takes you farther than you want to go, keep you longer than you want to stay, and cost you more than you want to pay. I'm going to say that again. It's a good thought. Sin takes you farther than you want to go. Just ask an addict to whatever it might be. Keeps you longer than you want to stay. The person who sees the flash of pornography go across their screen on the computer and then starts to keep looking at it, and pretty soon they're stuck to it. And cost you more than you wanted to pay. Again, anybody who goes to the gospel mission and interacts with people down there knows the cost they have to pay sometimes. But Jesus is there to help us out. H.M.S. Richards tells a story about when he was about 6 or 7 years old. He and his grandfather went out to check the traps that his grandfather had set out all around the countryside. And it was getting near dark and getting near evening, and he had one more trap to check, the grandfather did. But Richards, being just 5 or 6 years old, was getting tired. So Grandpa says, look, son, I want you to come over here. And he took him, he lifted him up about this high off the ground onto a ledge where there was kind of a small little rock cave. He said, I want you to get back in there, and I want you to stay there. Stay there, and I will be back within about a half an hour. You'll be all right. And he went on. Well, as dark came, Richards Loud said his mind and his imagination took off. So every little cricket sounded like a roaring lion. And every little leaf that fell sounded like an earthquake. And he could hear the coyotes in the far, far distance as if they were right next to him. And he was scared. And he wanted to go find Grandfather, but Grandfather said, stay there and stay protected. So he did, and after a bit, he fell asleep. Grandfather came back and found him asleep, picked him up and carried him back. He protected him from all the things that were going on around him. So number one, we've looked at the first P of Psalms 91, the ways that God protects us. Protection words: fortress, refuge, shield, feather, those types of things. Now we've seen how Satan provokes us physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. Number three, we now will see what God's promises. We've seen what God is. He's a protection. Now we'll see what God says he'll do, the actions he says he'll do. So the overall goal, verse 7, says this: 1,000 may fall at your side, 10,000 at your right hand, but it will not come near you. And then he says in verse 10, no harm shall befall you. No disaster will come near your tent. Why? Porque, as they would say in Spanish. Because verse 11, very famous verse. This is a famous verse because it's the only one of the few times in the Bible where Satan quoted the Bible. He quoted this verse in Matthew 4 and Luke 4 when he was tempting Jesus and told Jesus, jump off the palace, the temple. Everything will be okay. For he will command his angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways, he said. Now you read these verses and you say, yeah, great. But then if you're like me, and I have it written right here, so I'm not just making this up, quite people ask the question, if God says these things, how do I accept it when I have problems in my life? He says here, they will not come near you. They will not befall you. The angels will guard you. then how come godly people are having these problems? How come I'm having these problems? How come there are diseases? How come there's disaster? How come my house burnt down 2 years ago? On and on and on. Where is God? Ever hear people say that? Have you said that before? Where was God when this junk was going on? I thought you said, and again, what he said in verse 7, verse 10, 11. Now, I believe in God's promises. All of what 91 says. So how do I answer that question? If God says these things, and yet disaster befalls all of us, how do I answer that? Is God speaking out of both sides of his mouth? What's going on here? Well, first of all, I know in Matthew 4 and Luke 4 that Jesus went through the same junk we go through. In fact, probably worse, because he was who he was. And Satan was using his A game against Jesus in those temptations. And yet Jesus shows us how to overcome them by trusting God. Jesus said, as was read today in John 16:33, in this world you will have trials and tribulations, but cheer up, because he says, I've overcome. Interesting thing happened about 3 or 4 years ago. You might vaguely remember if you saw it in the paper. It happened on a Saturday morning. I think the paper had this article about it more on Monday. I was driving from my house up to Ukiah to speak up there, and I was supposed to get up there for what they call their sunrise service at 9 o'clock. And I had just gone past Cloverdale, and you know when you leave Cloverdale on 101, you kind of go up a hill, and then you go along like this. Then you come down, and there's Geyser Road, and then you get on that long stretch of 4 lanes. And I was on that 4-lane part for maybe about, maybe 2 or 3 minutes, where I came around the curve, and I saw all these cars, bumper to bumper, and I said, oh great, an accident. So I stopped, and all the cars are stopped, so I turned off the engine. A few moments, a couple helicopters came by. I saw where they landed, and I saw, the accident's up so far. And I just said, I know I'm not going to make it there for the 9 o'clock service. I already scratched that one off. So I just sat there, went over another sermon I had, and just waited and said, finally the car got to go, and we took off and went. Came upon the accident scene, and I saw the 2 cars that were in the accident, and one of them, half of the car was gone. And I thought, person in that car is dead, and the other one didn't look much better. Well, Monday I read about the accident. It was in the paper. In fact, the same scene I saw, that picture was in the paper. The lady who was in the car that was cut in half, she was driving from Ukiah to, I think it was Hayward, for a Bible study that day, and maybe for the weekend. And she was going down the road. She saw this car crossing the center line, coming right at her. And she had 2 choices. I can go to my right and get out of the way, but if I go fast, I'm going fast, and I go out of control, I go over the edge and go down the Russian River. So she went this way, and the car hit her and cut her in half. She got bumps and bruises and got a hurt knee, a badly bruised knee, and she was on crutches, but she lived. Because as she was coming down the road, she was thinking about that Bible study. In fact, she said she was listening to K-Love and was listening to Christian music and was singing a song while it was happening. God was watching over her. The guy who hit her was on drugs and alcohol, and he ended up getting hurt a lot worse. And I think he spent a lot of time, I hope, in jail. So when we have these situations where God says, no, none of these things are going to happen to you, and then they do, what we had to do is look at the big picture. For when I hear people say, well, where was God when this happens? I immediately want to say, okay, Revelation 12, battle in heaven. Satan's, and I think of Isaiah, where Satan says, I want to be like God. And when he started the great controversy and the war in heaven. Of all places, war in heaven. And then I go to Genesis 3 and see how he came to this earth and started the mess. And as soon as he started sin, God described what was going to happen, and on and on and on and on and on. And I see that, I say, it's not God's fault. Jesus himself tells that story about the man who sowed the wheat, and his workers came in about a month or so later, and he says, I thought you planted wheat. And he says, I did. Well, there's a bunch of weeds in the wheat. What happened? Did you get a lousy farming place to get your seeds? And he said, an enemy has done that. So it's not God's fault. An enemy has done that. So he only asks us to do one thing, according to verse 14, our part. That's all he tells us to do. In verse 14 he says, because he loves me, and he acknowledges my name. That's all he asks us to do. To love him and to acknowledge him. That's all he asks us to do. The rest, so he wants our total focus on him. That's why Paul says in Philippians 3:13 and 14, he says, one thing I do, I forget what's behind, and I strain towards what's ahead, and I focus, and my whole focus is on heaven and God. So, what God does, starting at verse 14, he gives the 7 I wills. And here they are. First, I will rescue him. That's what the whole psalm is about, is how God rescues us. He says in 1 Corinthians 10:13, no temptation to come upon us is not common to all people. God is faithful. He will not let us be tempted beyond what we can handle. But when we're tried and tempted, he will give us the way out. He will rescue us. Then he says in verse 14, I will protect him. Again, that's what all of Psalm 91 is about. He gives 9 protection words. Then he says in 15, he will call on me, and I will answer him. Have you prayed to God about something and nothing seems to be happening? I have those happen all the time. I'm wondering, God, what is going on here? Why don't you step in right now and take care of this situation? Why do I have to have this going on? He's got some plan that he hasn't told me about yet. Psalms 34:4 says, I sought the Lord and he answered me and delivered me from all my fears. Isaiah 65:24, before we call God, he says, I will answer. While I'm speaking to him, he will hear. So I will rescue, I will protect. He will call and I will answer. Verse 15, I will be with him in trouble. So when we're having all these troubles, God's right here promised, I will be with him in trouble. I will never fail you nor forsake you, Joshua 1:5. Then verse 15, he continues, I will deliver him and honor him. So again, 1 Corinthians 10:13, I will give you the way out, deliver you, and honor. Jude 24 says, he will keep us from falling. He will present us in his glorious presence without fault and with great joy. He will honor us. Then in verse 16, the 6th I will satisfy with a long life. He says, I've come to give life and give it more abundantly. A long life. Again, he tells us he will be our healer. He tells us how to be that. And then he says in verse 16, I will show him my salvation. There's a lot of great verses in, especially 1 Corinthians 15:55 to 57, talking about how God will be our victor, how we will have peace in him. And I don't have time right now to go over those because I want to finish up with this last story. This last story talks about aspects of what I've talked about protection and about provocation and about promise. And I probably told this story before, but that's okay. You probably forgot it since I told you last. But it was a gentleman who was a young man who got involved in gangs and drugs and everything that was going on with gangs and gang banging and fighting against other gangs and knives and shots going off, and then the party life of drugs and getting high and going out and fighting. And he would get into these brawls and situations and come home a mess. And his mom would always meet him at the door, always take his clothes off, shove him in a shower, and have him get cleaned up and give him a good meal and say, I'm praying for you, son. You don't need to go back out there. And after a few days, he'd be back in the same mess again. Does this story sound familiar yet? It does so far? Okay. No. Well, one morning, he got up with a sore toe. Now, that's very elusive until I tell you where he was and what was happening. The night before, he had been in a gang fight again, and the gang was chasing him, and he took off down this alley and was running for his life, and he was in a drug alcohol haze. And the first place he could find was this one dumpster. So he dove into the dumpster, and he heard the guys go running by looking for him. They didn't find him. So he woke up in the morning with a sore toe. Not because he stubbed his toe when he jumped in the dumpster. For in that dumpster was a mess, garbage and filth and stuff. And what was going on was there was a rat about as big as a large cat gnawing on his toe. So he shook the rat away and got up and pulled himself out and fell on the ground as he got out of the dumpster. Just reeked of just foul garbage mess, and came on home. And when he opened the door, his mom greeted him. She says, stay here. And she helped him take his dirty clothes off, and she shoved him in the shower, turned it on full blast, and went in and started making a meal. He was in there quite a while because it took a while to get A, the filth out, and number B, to sober up. Finally, when he came out and sat down, there was that luscious meal, and he was hungry, and he ate a lot, and she even gave him more. And as he was eating, she says, son, I've been praying for you and praying for you. Don't you think you've hit rock bottom enough? And he says, yeah. She says, Billy Graham is having a series in our city right now. Why don't you come with me tonight? He went, he did, and when Graham called him forward, he said, I need that. And he came forward, and the story he told is a story he told at one of the Graham Crusades about 3 or 4 years later. He told an audience about his story. Protection. Mom prayed. God watched over. Provocation. Satan was doing all he could to get him down. And the promises, God watched over him. This morning, we can take this with us as we walk out of here and remember this. And when we're going through rough times, and we will, remember how God's going to watch over us and protect us like he said. Let's pray. And Jesus, I'm so thankful that we have Psalms 91 to remind us, because sometimes things are going on. We wonder, where are you? What is going on? Why is this happening? And you said, here, you'll take care of it. So, Lord, I ask now that we learn to humble ourselves before you, to trust you to take care of it. In Jesus' name, amen.